All right, so all guests on ZASLOW Show 2.0 brought to us by the official beer of the program, Johnny Cuba, European roots with that Caribbean soul, a refreshing German lager in a can. Pick up a six-pack of Johnny Cuba for yourself, your local Sedanos, Presidente, Winn-Dixie, Fresco y Mas. I mean, how else are you going to enjoy WrestleMania this weekend than with an ice-cold Johnny Cuba in your hand? Make sure you always drink responsibly, and don't forget Johnny Cuba's mantra, stay tranquilo. So, WrestleMania 40 this weekend. I'm super pumped. It really has the feel of what could be one of the great WrestleManias of all time. And joining us now, one of the all-time great WrestleMania performers, of course, is the Macho Man, Randy Savage. And Jon Finkel has a new book out, Macho Man, The Untamed, Unbelievable Life of Randy Savage. You can see, John, right over my shoulder, if I can point properly, right there. You see
Nice.
my finger? That's the Macho Man.
I love it.
That's a cartoon caricature of the Macho Man right there. One of the all-time great WrestleMania performers. Thanks a lot for joining us here on the show. How did you get the inspiration to write about Macho Man? And did you grow up a huge Macho Man fan?
Yeah, I grew up a diehard wrestling fan in general. So we're around the same age. I grew up a Big John Studd fan. I used to call myself Little John Studd when I was like 4, 5, and 6, just because my name was John. And I actually got a chance to meet him at a store opening, like when I was like 6 or 7, and had lunch with him. And he had like a 10-egg omelet and a loaf of French bread, a French toast. You know what I mean? Like he was just larger than life. And so he was my first guy that was my guy in wrestling. And then as I got a little older, 7, 8, Macho burst on the scene, like millions of us, and he was the guy you can't take your eyes off him. Especially I try my best in the book, and I think I did a pretty good job of putting people in the seat of like what seeing this man like for the first time was as an 8, 9, 12-year-old. Like he was just captivating, all the movements and the herky jerky stuff, and obviously the colorful outfits, but the voice, the athleticism, the Superman flying off the high elbow off the top rope. So he was my guy. And so when I became an author, later in life and a writer for most of my life, you have a list in the back of your head of books you want to do. And this is my 10th book, but it's like a bucket list biography for me. So it's been a long time coming.
Well, I totally get what you're saying with Macho, because while he wasn't my favorite wrestler, he was one of my favorites. He wasn't my favorite, but I always like to ask pro wrestling fans, when you fell in love with pro wrestling. And for me, WrestleMania 3, I was 6 years old, and I was watching Macho and Ricky Steamboat, which I still think is the greatest match of all time. I'm watching Macho and Ricky Steamboat, and I'm 6 years old, and it's like, I don't know exactly what I'm watching right now, but I know that I love this. That, like, this is for me.
Yeah, and the greatest thing about that was, and it's one of my favorite, when I started researching the book, one of my favorite things to do was to explain what's going on, with the actual matches. But I believed all this stuff, right? So like now it's very hard. My son's is 11 and he's into this, but he even knows he'll say like, oh, they got to get the belt off Roman, or like he kind of knows that it's because he's on social media. He's not on like we are where we would be, but he hears stuff. He gets the WWE app. He sees the updates. He gets that there's some planning and things involved. Me, you, millions of us, I thought Steamboat's bell. I thought he was hospital and bedridden in the whole lead up to the whole thing.
Yeah.
Like I had no idea what was going on. And that was one of my first forays. And the real one where I was a little bit older and had it's funny that I think about this now because I've been talking about this so much, and WrestleMania is coming up. But when Macho fought Ultimate Warrior, who was my second, those were my 1 and 1A guys. And it was the quote unquote retirement match. I remember sitting in my middle school cafeteria, like we were all like, so whoever loses is never wrestling again.
Yeah.
Can you believe this? Like that was we were in. And so, you get a little, probably 1 or 2 years later and you realize, you kind of the jig is up. But there was a joy there that we got to have before social media, before the internet, before all this, where it was like we purely were bought into the angles, and it was awesome.
It's so true. I mean, I remember one of my boys when he was maybe like 8, and he's watching wrestling, and one of my friends, does he know it's fake? And I would turn to my friend and go, you will shut the fuck up, and he will learn it's fake when he learns it's fake. He's not going to learn it from you. He's going to find out on his own. just like we did when we were kids.
Yeah.
And it's so different now. So you were a huge Macho Man fan, obviously growing up. Who did you want to talk to for research for the book that you were most excited to get information from?
Yeah, the number one most crucial person that I wanted to talk to was Lanny Poffo, his brother, who's passed away. So I actually had the proposal done after my last book came out. It was called 1996, a biography. It was a biography of the sports year of 1996. And so one of those chapters was about the Rock and Stone Cold coming into the WWE the same year. 96, they came in as Rocky Maivia, and Stone Cold was actually the ring general, and then they fixed their characters to who we knew from them. And so my next book, I wanted to be Macho. It just felt right for me. I knew it was a monumental task with his baseball life, with his wrestling life, with his whole family's lineage. And so at the time, I just felt like the only person that I was like critical, like if I don't talk to this guy, I'm not going to do it because I'll feel like a fraud, was Lanny. So it took about a year, like a full year. Lanny lived in Ecuador half the year. He was off social media. Fortunately, I bring up 96 because one of the sources I interviewed for that chapter had done an early podcast with Lanny back in the 2010s, 11, 12s when they were kind of just starting. So he vouched for me and got me in touch with Lanny. And after a full year of finally talking to him, he kind of hammered me with a bunch of questions early on, like a gauntlet of like, why you? But I think he liked that I wasn't kind of like a wrestling writer lifer where I just had my own thoughts. Like I was coming at it from more of a mainstream side. I explained to him that I'd written for GQ and Men's Health and Men's Fitness, and I'd done all these cover stories on these wrestlers when I was a writer for Muscle and Fitness, on Triple H and Batista, and so like I wasn't my first go round at all with wrestling, but I was a journalist first, and I was going to handle it that way. And so I passed his initial run of questions, and then we spoke for hours and hours and hours. And so he was the linchpin. Once I talked to him, everything fell in place.
I saw on your social media, and you can go at Jon_Finkel. And I saw on your social media that in, I guess, preparation for writing the book, you went to the site of the crash that took his life. Can you tell me a little about that?
Yeah, that was heavy. So it was like, when you do a book like this, you want to spend time where this person spends time, right? So I did a biography on Charlie Ward, a few years ago. That was my book before 96 or close to that. And, I spent time in Thomasville where he grew up, and on Florida State campus and the Swamp, and where their things happened in their lives. And so with Macho, he grew up in Downers Grove in Chicago, just outside of Chicago, but he spent a bulk of his life around the Tampa area, and he passed away at the wheel of a car. Wheel of a Jeep, actually. He had a heart attack, slumped over, and it's really crazy when you go on the road. So it's two 2-lane roads, one going one way, one going the other. And when he slumped over, he was still well over 220, 30 pounds. His foot stuck on the gas, and they crossed over. And his wife, who's still alive, saved a lot of lives into oncoming traffic. She lunged over, yanked his foot off the accelerator, threw the wheel to the left, and it slammed into this tree. That was just a tree on this guy's property. And it's not marked. There's no memorial sign up. It's just this tree, thousands of them all throughout, where we live, South Florida and Tampa and all that. And so I had to do some sleuthing. I found up the police report and some local news sites, and you can Google, and there's a couple places that have an address close to it, but you still have to find it. So I took my daughter with me she loves road trips. It was, fun to take her up there. And when we finally got close, it was a real detective thing. I had a picture of the tree, an intersection of well, here's this church and there's a CVS over there. This has to be it. So after, the 3.5, 4-hour drive up, we stop. I have cousins who live up there. We finally go around looking for it. We see it. I bang a U-turn and pull over. And she's like, is this it? I'm like, I think. And, he died 13 years ago. I don't know if there's anything even going to be there. And it was one of those chills moment. As we're walking up, all of a sudden you see these purple tassels flailing in the wind that had been tacked to it. And you see all these stickers of the Macho Man sunglasses. And then there's Slim Jim wrappers thumbtack basically all around it. And the craziest thing was at the base are these two old school Macho Man wrestling figures that you and I probably had, those 8-inch rubbery ones. And my daughter goes running up and she's like, oh my God, look at all this stuff here. This is, people really care about him. They still remember. And I was emotional. Yes, this is 12 years ago at a random tree. He passed away. And here we are almost over a decade later, and people are still putting things up in his memory. They're still stopping by and paying homage to him. And then the icing on the cake, as someone who does what we do for a living, is The guy who owns the house on the property was home. He saw us outside. He waved. He's like, "What are you doing?" I told him, and he lived there at the time. He was home when it happened. He explained like what it was like with the media to show up, how like he's kind of had to embrace that around the anniversary every year. There's lines of cars going and people putting.
Did he know when the accident happened? Did he know who Macho Man was?
Pretty quickly, yeah. So Macho was very visible in Tampa. He was very open. He was eating at a Perkins diner before that. Like he was around. If you saw him, he was. A lot of the wrestlers who lived there, they lived there because it was like accepted that wrestlers were around. It wasn't like he was mobbed everywhere he went. It was like eventually you just see him, and eventually it's not a big deal to see him. And if you are polite and ask for an autograph or a picture or whatever, or even talk to him, he was cool. I mean, he lived for a long time in a tower in Tampa, and people would see him on his deck and yell, "Ooh, yeah," and he'd wave and all this kind of stuff. And then as he got older and really kind of moved out of the spotlight a little bit, he bought this place in deeper in Seminole County. Is like I drove there. That's part of why I was up there. It's like one of those roads, in those areas in Florida where like you kind of all of a sudden you're in a lot of trees and there's a bunch of roads and there's a mailbox and there's a house somewhere back there and there's a beware of dog sign. If you live down here, there's these neighborhoods that are like that, and these aren't necessarily, they're just secluded. There might be a massive house back there with whatever, and he bought an acre of land, and my daughter and I drove up and got pretty close, and I don't know if his ex-wife still lives there, but we got to see kind of his evolution from where he lived and where he was, and that tree experience, it's just wild. There's nothing there, and I'm not sure there ever will be. But the fact that enough people are like going online, I mean, they're not journalists. They're just looking and sleuthing and going to pay homage is awesome.
The book is Macho Man, The Untamed, Unbelievable Life of Randy Savage. Do we know if at this point in his life before he passed away, what was his standing like with WWE at that point? Do you think we would have seen him again? Not in the spotlight, but would we have seen him again part of the promotion?
It seems like we were headed there. Lanny always joked when we were talking that Randy had an FU list a mile long. He just held on to grudges for most of his life, whether it was Vince or Hogan or just random people who throughout his career he thought slighted him or whatever. But it started to thaw when he finally moved out. One of like the visible manifestations that Lanny said of him just kind of chilling and understanding that he had achieved immortality in wrestling. I think through those late 90s periods, when you do these books, you become like a pop psychologist. It seemed like he didn't get that he had done it. He kept kind of grasping at, TNA wrestling and the rap album and all these things, which are fine to try to do. But he wasn't, it seemed like he just didn't get that he had done it. Like he was safe. He was safely in the pantheon, and he didn't need to grasp at straws and try to stay relevant. He could have just been who he was and been fine. And so Lanny said that at the very end of the last several years of his life, he got remarried to a sweetheart that he dated back in the 70s when he was a minor league baseball player and hadn't seen for 25 or 30 years. He kind of let all the stuff go. We've all seen the pictures. He let his hair go white. He stopped tanning. He stopped worrying about the wild and crazy beard and having to look the part. He stopped dyeing his hair. He stopped like wearing so many of the crazy things. He kind of dressed like a guy in his mid-50s who lived at the beach, And so he allowed WWE into his house for a shoot of for something. He did that famous last video where he was talking about the action figures in the video game. And it seemed like he had thawed with Hogan. He ran into him famously at a doctor's office where he was, when he retired finally out of the spotlight, he spent so much time on the road. His parents were both still alive in their 80s, and he would take them to their doctor's appointments, and just a good son. He was always close to them. And so it seemed like we were headed there, and we definitely missed like a grand return. We definitely missed that WrestleMania or SummerSlam moment where all of a sudden Macho's coming out in full gear, soaking it up, especially with how they've done a good job where, whenever in Tampa, they bring Hogan out for things, and they've managed to bring some of the old stars back for a lot of the big events. We certainly were robbed. And who knows, he was so talented. He could have been on a TV show. Like he really had that thing down where he was good. He could have been an actor. He could have gone into other things. So we'll never know, but I think we were headed there.
Granted, the 80s were a lot different when it came to pro wrestling, but he really lived as Macho Man, right?
Yeah. It's amazing. One of my favorite stories, I was talking for those of us who grew up then, Hacksaw Jim Duggan. So Hacksaw was telling me, he called him Hacker, which is great. He's like, hey, Hacker. Like, that's how he talked to Hacker, which is just, I love that stuff. Like, I love learning that he called Hacksaw Jim Duggan Hacker. And they would go and like, they'd be, you know, Hacksaw had his wife travel with him a little bit sometimes. And obviously Liz was always around Macho, and like, they'd finish a show and like head to a McDonald's or something just to grab a bite before they'd get on the tour bus or get on a flight or something. And when he first met Macho Man, you know, they'd all go in, these giant guys as they were, you know, I'll have a number 2 or whatever. And, you know, he all of a sudden, Macho's in front of him in line, is like, I'll have a large fry. And he's like, you know, he remembers thinking, like, you can let it go. Like the midnight shift Macho, you know, McDonald's worker doesn't need the full Macho experience. And then he realized there's only one thing, and that's the full Macho experience.
He took the profession very, very seriously. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, if you like when you talk to these other wrestlers and you talk to people who are around him, especially in the mid 70s in the territories where he worked against Jerry Lawler and some of those guys, there's no one who took it more seriously. And really that comes from his baseball career. I mean, that was the first third of the book is fascinating to me. It's about a young guy who is the best baseball player in his town, the best baseball player in his county. He hits 500 as a junior, learns to switch hit, then hits 500 again as a senior. An absolute phenom who, if you went to high school with or I went to high school with, you would say Randy Popo is going to be in the major leagues. Like, you can't get him out in Little League. I mean, he would have seasons where he barely got out in Little League, and he could do it all. And then he doesn't get drafted, but he famously drives to a tryout with 300 other wannabes and is the only guy they sign of anyone who's trying out. And so with the Cardinals. And then this is his baseball is his whole life. And then when that dream dies after an injury and he's just not good enough, he flips his entire mentality to becoming a wrestler. That wasn't his first thing, even though his father was a wrestler. And what he does there is one of the most remarkable things. It's even why I was drawn to him. I mean, we all played sports. You know, when you're 22, 23, most of our, you know, whether you play in college, a rec league, club, frat league, whatever, you're done at that point. And for him at that point, he goes from 6'1", 185 and says, all right, if I'm going to be a wrestler, I got to look like a wrestler. And he puts on like 45 pounds of muscle, learns how to do all this stuff, and then from a whole cloth creates the Macho Man character.
Was he always, you know, like you said, that the first third of the book is about, you know, coming up and his baseball career. Was he always a character? Like, did the people around him who grew up with him know that he can be this guy?
No, that's the best part about doing these books is when you're talking. So I talked to everyone in his neighborhood who lived with him. I talked to almost his whole high school baseball team, his coaches. I talked to people who lived with him in the minors. His whole career, I was able to find people who would talk to it. And so many of the conversations start with like, you're starting at the end of the movie where you know he becomes this Macho Man. But if you, for that time, the best line that I got was like, you know, I was like, was it, you know, what was it like? And they're like, nobody gave a crap. He was just another guy hitting 290, you know, hang on to his baseball life. He was intense and driven, and they all kind of said definitely one of the hardest workers in the room. He was doing 1,500 sit-ups every day, and like you could see him in the weight room building his body, and he had all these like practice things that he would do. He would hit a tire hanging from a tree thousands of times to strengthen his wrists and forearms. He used to use these weighted baseballs and just squeeze them all the time to build up his hand strength. But he wasn't boisterous. He wasn't a locker room cut up. He wasn't a clown. He wasn't the alpha guy or big man on campus type guy at all. And most of the friends that he had who stayed in touch with him, they called the Macho character like the other guy. Like maybe they would call that in the Avengers, like with the Hulk. Like they called him the other guy, to the point where many of the guys who got back in touch with him, the first time they, you know, there was no Facebook, there was no cell phones or like social media. Like they would see wrestling because they would watch it or their kids would watch it. And it took someone else to confirm or even say, like, did you know that Randy Savage is actually Randy Poffo? Because, you know, the last time they saw him, he was clean shaven, clean haircut, 185 pounds, normal clothes, jeans and a t-shirt guy. And the next time they see him, he's 240, wild hair, beard, sunglasses on national TV.
How much did we get to on him and Miss Elizabeth?
A lot. I mean, their story is a very like regular meathead love story that like, it's a dude who walks into a gym every day and one day walks in and there's a pretty, you know, brunette with pretty brown eyes sitting behind the counter and he introduces himself. And as Macho says, it was love at first sight, because when she looked at me, what's not to love?
That is great. To go back to how serious he took the business, if I remember correct, they were married, of course, in real life. And if I remember correctly, on screen, when he split from Miss Elizabeth, he became a heel. He aligned himself with Queen Sherry. In order to sell it, they really divorced in real life so that there was paperwork if any reporter actually dig and see if they were still together. They had to know that he and Miss Elizabeth were in fact not married anymore. Is that true?
Well, it's not true. It's actually more of a mind screw than that. So this is really what it was they'd been married. They got married way before she even came to WWE, and Macho did. They got married early in the 70s when he was with the ICW, the Outlaw Wrestling crew with Lawler. This time when they became famous and she became basically a household name as well was pretty much awful for them. They had some moments where it worked, but he became very possessive. There was just the two of them. It was very much like a boys' club on the road, and she was oftentimes the only woman. Or they'd go somewhere and there wasn't even a locker room for her. They would have to find a room for her to change and do her things in, and maybe some friend of a friend would help her with her hair or whatever they were doing. It was very stressful on their marriage and relationship. And so what actually happened was, while they have this reconciliation after WrestleMania 7, after Queen Sherry turns on him,
what a moment! What a moment!
What a moment! I mean, anyone listening who was there, there was Gorilla Monsoon says, there's not a dry eye in the house, and there really wasn't. You wanted them back together for that year, plus they were apart after Mega Powers, after the implosion. You're picked to choose a side. Macho comes out to wrestle, Warrior, and they pan over and Liz is in the stands, and you're like, what is she doing there? And I don't want to recreate the whole thing. It's worth watching on YouTube. It's an amazing moment. He hugs her, he loved her. He's always loved her. All the famous announcing happens. And when that is going on, they're separating in real life. So by the time SummerSlam and Match Made in Heaven happens, and we are as kids and as fans, waiting for this real wedding. We think we're seeing a real wedding, and Macho is decked out. In fact, it's the outfit we use on the cover of the book. Liz is ready. He does the famous, do you? And he's like, oh, yeah. And he's almost crying. They're divorced. They're done. They don't live together. And can you imagine as an adult? It's easy as a kid to get swept up in it. But, when you're married, they don't have any kids, thankfully. But he's at the pinnacle of his, life. He's doing, in terms of wrestling, these major WrestleMania headlining matches, even though he lost the belt, but he's still the headliner. And then they're actually behind the scenes, the scene ends. They do the wedding, they do the Jake the Snake. All this stuff is happening, and they're planning it. They were getting into planning this fake wedding, and they're separated.
I love it so much, but I can also acknowledge it's such a weird world. Yes. That world of pro wrestling. Was there anything? I'll let you go with this, Jon. Again, the book is Macho Man: The Untamed, Unbelievable Life of Randy Savage. Is out now. You can order it wherever you get your books. I'll leave you with this. Was there anyone that you wanted to get in touch with and you just couldn't get a hold of?
No, fortunately, in a weird, macabre way, when he passed away, 2011, pretty much everybody who was anybody went on a podcast or several or radio shows. From Hulk, they were all on the record saying the same stories over and over. They did the documentary. So I had some of the bigger names. I got in touch with Tito Santana and Steamboat and all the guys that you would want to. But even on the positive side, when you do books like this, it's always the person that you didn't expect or you didn't really think about, who wasn't on your radar. And so many of these wrestlers passed away that it's I'll never get this perspective. But one of the best interviews in the book, and I'll leave it as a kind of a tease, is I got in touch with Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff's son, who Macho called Mr. So-So, which is just one of the best Macho things. Mr. So-So in comparison. And his name's Travis. He was our age. His father is Mr. Wonderful, kissing your biceps, Paul Orndorff. His father's best buddies are Hogan and Macho and Junkyard Dog and all these guys. And he had the perspective of, after these matches, his dad took him on the road with him when there wasn't school or over the summers. So he spent significant time on the tour bus where the show ends and he gets on the bus and Macho's in the back and Andre the Giant's in the corner and Hulk's playing cards and, $1 Million Man's with, they're all there. So he had a great perspective and some great stories. So I did get in touch with pretty much everybody I wanted to, and people like that who really filled out how Macho Man reacted and was, amazingly, his whole life, he was incredible with kids.
Now, John, you're going to WrestleMania this weekend. I know you said you're taking your son.
Yeah.
Do you have book signing? I mean, look, we got people here in South Florida who are making the trip to Philadelphia. I mean, you go from all around the country, all around the world to WrestleMania. So where can folks catch you this weekend?
Yeah, I will be at WrestleCon on Sunday. So it's their big signing event. There's, I'm not saying I'm next to Ric Flair, but Ric Flair is there and Sting is there and Jake the Snake and Hacksaw Jim Duggan, who I've stayed in touch with through Twitter. I'm gonna give him a book. He's gonna sign a few books when I bring him over. So I'll be at WrestleCon. It's at, I think, the Sheraton or whatever it is for most of the morning Sunday. Saturday I'll be at that WWE World. I'm actually going to give away some books. We're going to do an event there. So I'll be around, and then obviously both nights and tweeting and texting and things like that. So it's awesome. I can't wait. We've got like I said, it's a bucket list book to write, and then getting to bring my son along with all this stuff. And he's filmed anyone who follows on Twitter. I've done goofy promos. I was Macho promoting this book for 4 months now. So he's filmed all that. He's earned the right to come and sit with me and sit down in that stadium and watch.
Will this be his first WrestleMania?
Yes, we've done. When we lived in Dallas, I took him to a bunch of shows, and we did. Anyone who lives here, they do the house shows. They do them down in Miami at the basketball arena, and it's one of the best events. I've done it twice now. Phenomenal. You can get great seats for pretty affordable prices. It's a great arena for it. We went this past summer. I took my son and my nephew. Saw Cody and Seth and all these. It was fantastic. So I actually like the house shows. I think anyone who really is into this stuff likes the intimacy. You can get closer without spending $1 zillion. But yeah, this will be his and my first WrestleMania, so it'll be great.
Wow, you're going to have a great time. It's really a lot of fun. You guys are going to have a great time. Good job, John. Again, the book is Macho Man, The Untamed, Unbelievable Life of Randy Savage, out now wherever you get your books. This was fun. Thanks for joining us, and you're going to have a great weekend.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on, and I'll come on and tell you all about it one day soon.
Awesome.